Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It is indeed my pleasure to be here with you today. And I wish you a blessed Jum'ah. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the blessed khitam of Ramadan, end of Ramadan, and a blessed Eid. I was invited to talk about Islamic civilization and يعني, mainly past and future, present challenges, etc. And we know that our civilization is facing a lot of challenges. I would like to start with a concept that is more near to our everyday life. So it's easy to talk about civilization in terms of history, civilization in terms of as we say in social sciences, grand narrative, talk about philosophy, history, the occupation, colonialism, and then liberation movements, and then the challenges of modernity, etc. But I would like to take another approach. I would like to take more of an Islamic approach to civilization as a definition itself, as a concept, by starting with different concepts and making a map that actually it's easy to remember, because the end of each variable or factor ends in Arabic with an alif nun. So it will be easy to remember. And this is the way I usually tend to introduce most of the topics through these variables and factors. The first thing I think that we should start with is al-irfan. What is the nature of the knowledge of the material and the transcendental? So in every civilization, there is a concept of the transcendental, even if in some ideologies, for example, there is a negation of the existence of the transcendental and the metaphysical, for example. So we are talking about the conception of the transcendental and the world, basically, the cosmology, how we think about the world. And we had civilizations that were based on paganism. And civilization is not something that is good or bad. It's a description. We talk about the rise and fall of civilizations. We talk about the differences among civilizations. So civilizations have criteria. They don't have to be all tawhidi civilizations, but we put the preference according to what we see in our world regarding the most balanced view. Because if you are coming from a materialist paradigm, that negates the metaphysical, that negates the divine, then you probably will see Muslim civilizations and Christian civilization, etc., as basically backward. I mean, this is what modernity has been establishing its endeavor on. So the first dimension I start with is usually irfan. What type of knowledge, what type of position towards the transcendental and the divine is there in a civilization to be able to compare? And this is just an introduction to how we can compare civilizations and how we can see the different elements that basically establish any civilization. The second dimension is the dimension of al-akwan. Okay, so is our understanding of the different creations, the story of creation itself, that is basically related to the previous dimension and the previous question, because based on our understanding of the divine and the answer to the question of the divine, whether by negation or acceptance, our understanding of the world will be shaped. Because if you negate the existence of the divine, then you will assume that there was a big bang. You will go to a theory of Darwinism, for example, a theory of mythology. That this world was created from the womb of the mother of so and so. We have the creation of the world in the Indian civilization. We have the Indian culture. We have the understanding of the world in pagan historical context. So you imagine the world and Genesis, the creation of the world, nature, and man, human beings, based on the answer of the first question. And in our case, we believe in the story of Adam. We believe that there is a connection between the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of this world and us being in this world and being entrusted to have this amana of imaratul ard, of being responsible for this world. So here there is a story. And if you want to create a different civilization, you have to have a different narrative. You have to and to have a different understanding of these questions. So we start with the irfan, whether is there a God or not. And of course, this is why we have irfan and jahiliyyah. We have acknowledgement of God and tawheed, and we have a shirk billah and kufr. We have these aspects. And then this is our understanding. This is our Islamic perspective of civilization. So you look for this when you are analyzing civilization, while other civilizations look based on technological achievement only, or based on a specific practice of a rational tradition. And you try to build from an Islamic perspective a more balanced view that acknowledges the existence of the metaphysical and transcendental, and has a specific concept of the divine, and then hence has the specific understanding of what is this human species, where did it come from, what type of mission does it carry in this world. And I think this is the second dimension. So we have al-irfan, the knowledge of the divine, negated or accepted, or transformed and distorted. And then we have al-akwan, coming from kawn, the cosmos, and how it was created, and our position in this cosmos. Then comes the notion of al-mizan. What is the balance that is basically or the order in which this world has been shaped? Was it like when the Greeks mentioned in their understanding of the world and the existence, that there is a creator, but this creator basically made the first push, created the cosmos and man and humans, and then eventually started to rest. We have also this imaginary in some of the even religious traditions, non-Islamic religious traditions, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided to take a day of rest, or that God is not engaged anymore in the universe. And the universe is now, yes, there is a God, but it's like a clock. He created the clock, and the clock is ticking, and we don't need to have anything to do. He doesn't have anything to do with that. And then humans take over, etc. So what is our conception of the mizan? How are the sunan? What are the laws that are ruling through nature? Is it harmony only, like in some civilizations, or is it the will of man that pushes everything and puts it in order, or is it the qadar blended with our own will? So we have even in Islam al-du'a yaruddu al-qada, yani that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has his own fate. He created the world with this open notion of time. He knows what would happen, and he knows how we will act, but we are the willful actors, so the notion of the mizan. What is the mizan? Is it only the power dynamics, or is there a moral code, or is the moral code accompanied by a revelation? Because we have civilizations that think that it's only the wisdom and human reason that can discover the good and the bad, al-qabih wal-hasan, and then we can manage our own affairs as human beings. And we have other civilizations that believe that we have been based on a notion basically of revelation, that our mind works in order to make this ijtihad. But at the end of the day, there is a mode in there is a mode in the universe of sunan. There is a system that we are looking for in the nature, and in ourselves as well. Sunnatullahi fi khalqihi, sunnatullahi fil ard, etc. There is that sort of order. Or sometimes we call it nizamul alam. There is a system in this world, and also to which extent human beings are gifted by the ability to basically shape their own material world and circumstances, and use this transcendental knowledge through the wahi to basically guide them to what is right and wrong, what is halal and haram, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, and setting the standards for manners and ethics. So we have the irfan, we have the akwan, the cosmos, the creation, and our position. And we have the mizan. In some civilizations, man produces law, man introduces his own ideas regarding ethics, and we reached in our modern times the level of talking about invented moralities. You know, they say, no, we have our own invented moralities and we can invent morality. Morality is something that human beings can create. And we reach the level of relativity. You know that in some the modern civilization is talking about everyone sets his own standards, or human beings agree on the standards of morality and ethics, or leave it to the private sphere. And in the public sphere, we sit together, we agree on the system of this and the order that we want to establish. We make a constitution that only depends on our deliberation and our vision of the world, and that's it. And then we have a system, social system, educational system, and we have the public policies, and we give importance and weight to different spheres in society, and we create our own nizam. So the humans in modernity basically have their own nizam al-alam, and they are the creator of nizam al-alam. And the stories of the religious origin of this world and of man's responsibility in it, and al-hudud, not in terms of punishment, hudud in terms of what are our limitations in this world? Where should we stop when we are acting in social life, political life, economic life, etc., are man-made, all of them. So there is a difference. And if you want to compare civilizations, you compare them accordingly. So now we have al-irfan, the question of the divine. We have al-akwan, the cosmos. We have al-mizan. What are the standards? What is the frame of reference that we are referring to? And whether there is a dimension of revelation or a negation of this connection between the divine and the human through the notion of an-nubuwah, prophethood. So it's a very important, actually, notion that maybe did not take enough attention in our modern times, especially from the Islamic movements that basically focused on the social and the political, sometimes the economic as well. But the notion of nubuwah and how it affects our perception of the human nature, and what level can it reach without turning the prophetic into divine. The prophetic is a bridge between the human and the divine, and the Quran talks about that. Talks about the example of al-ghulu, la taghlu fi dinikum. Don't exaggerate in your religion. Don't add attributes to the prophet to turn them into a god. Al-Uzair, al-Yahud qalat al-Uzair ibn Allah. The Jews said Al-Uzair is the son of God, and the Christians said that Jesus is the son of God. So elevating the human to the level of the divine, or like in Greek times or in other pagan civilizations, imagining the divine in the image of the human. That there are gods, goddesses of beauty, and you come from the subcontinent where there is more understanding of this more multiple understanding of the divine, and imagining the goddesses and the gods, of war, and the gods of beauty and wisdom, etc. So imagining the divine Allah image, according to the image of the human, and that even gods marry amongst each other. I come from Egypt originally, so we have all these old Egyptian understandings of Isis, and the Iraqis have the understanding of Ishtar, and all these gods and goddesses, etc. So we have the human and we have the divine. What is the relation? Sometimes the human is at the image of the divine, and sometimes the divine is taking the shape of the human. In our Islamic understanding, there is the transcendental that is laysa kamithlihi shay. There is the realm of the transcendental that we believe in, that includes al-malaika wal-arsh wal-Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There is the realm of prophethood, and la nufarriqu bayna ahadin min rusulihi. We don't make a distinction between any of these prophets. And then there is the human society that aspires to establish its understanding of these elements that I mentioned. After al-irfan and al-akwan, the plural of the cosmos, the different worlds that the Quran also is talking about, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not only talks about as-samawati wal-ard, and that we should use our senses to see the beauty and the order of this cosmos, but also talks about talks about nations of creatures, umamun amthalukum, that we have the birds, we have the different insects, and we have the animals, and we have. So you imagine yourself in a setting in the Islamic civilization that empowers the humans, but they are entrusted. They are not the masters of the world. They are a master in the world, not of the world. So you have a responsibility, and you have your own mizan, which is the Quran and Sunnah, and you try to establish goodness in this world. And Imaratul Ard includes not only building architecture and cities, etc. Imaratul Ard and being responsible for this world includes also the nature, the dimension of nature, the dimension of having a more eco-friendly cities and eco-friendly technology. And so our understanding of the world is very complex. And if you look into the Sunnah, how Prophet Muhammad used to deal with different types of of the creation around, including actually even the natural world. You know, so he had a special love to the Jabal Uhud, to Uhud mountain, and he expressed this love to space. To Mecca, to Uhud, to the people of Medina, the Medina as a city, and he decided not to leave. It was more logical from a political historical perspective that after Fathu Mecca, after the return to Mecca, that he would settle in Mecca. This is his original city, and he could have said to the Sahaba, "Yani, thank you very much for the support, the Al-Muhajirun in Medina, Al-Ansar in Medina, thank you for the support, and now I go back to my city." And they would say, "Okay, and Islam, khalas, yani it's over. Islam is dominant, and that's it." But he made a promise once to the people of Medina that he will not leave them, and he fulfilled. So after Makkah, he returned to Medina. He went for Hajj, and then he returned and passed away, alayhi salatu wassalam, and was buried in Medina, not in Mecca. So it's interesting how these dynamics tell us something about the imaginary of what home means. For example, what is your home country, or our relation to nature, or our relation to cities and urban spaces, our identities and their nature. The heart might be somewhere, but there is a commitment, a social and political commitment, and it's a very complex background when we look at our heritage of the prophetic Sunnah and of the prophetic Seerah, and see how the Islamic civilization emerged and what principles basically it was based on. Then we enter the realm of Al-Insan. So after Al-Irfan and Al-Akwan and Al-Mizan, we enter the realm of the Insan. The Insan is a very complex aspect of civilization. Every single civilization imagined the human nature and the human being in a different way. And the basic question in social sciences, and especially in political science, which is my main field of study, is basically what is human nature? Because based on that, we will establish our understanding of society, of international relations, of political orders. And I will give you an example. If we assume that humans are good by nature, we will have a minimal state in terms of the political state. Okay, so you don't need authority if people are good. You only need minimal authority to sort of look after the borders, organize municipalities, look after the economic regulations and the legal aspects of running a society to the minimal level. But if the people are good, then the social network and the social fabric basically is responsible for many things. And the example is having waqf in Islam, endowments, and the society is responsible through the money of the zakat and sadaqat, not only of keeping people in a minimum of a human standard of good life, but also to be responsible for funding education, funding charity organizations through the Baytul Mal, funding different causes, even humanitarian causes, arts and culture, etc. It was all in the realm of society to be responsible for that. And the state was basically very minimal. People applied Sharia amongst themselves. The judicial system was basically pretty much itself in the realm of the ulama, and from the ulama came the muftis and came the qadis and weak states. Not weak in terms that the state is weak in terms of its relation to the society, not dominant in the term of the sovereignty of the modern state. The state is dominating and penetrating, and the society is declining and subject to the power of the state. There was a balance somehow. It starts with the question of human nature. And if we want to look to the insan, to this human creature, and look into the different aspects and how they are also representing perceptions of what is the best way to have a human society, and hence different types of civilizations. So if we want to divide the human nature, or what does it mean to be human in different factors and variables as well, we can start as well by the notion of al-adhan, الذهن, al-aql, so we have al-adhan, the rational dimension of the human being, and the limitations of reason. And here comes the reason in relation to learning from nature and learning from the revelation. And then we have the dimension of al-wujdan, which is the emotional dimension of the human beings, to which extent it should be cherished, this emotional dimension of compassion, of having responsibility towards humanity, of building this notion of self-awareness, and all these emotional dimensions. And we have al-abdan, the plural of badan, which means body. So we have the bodily dimension, and this is in some civilizations there is more focus on the body than on the reason, and some more on the reason than on the body. The body is humiliated in some religions, or there is a balance between the mind and the body and the emotional dimension. And we have also the al-hawas and the different senses, how we imagine the importance of sight, the responsibilities of hearing, including everything that is related to it, related to listening to rumors in society, or listening to ilm, or speaking the truth, or making shahada in the wider sense, shahada that Allah is the one and only, but also shahada in terms of being witnesses in this world, and وَأَقِيمُوا الشَّهَادَةَ لِلَّهِ. So it's very much related to our senses and our bodily existence, how we in different civilizations imagine mobility, for example, this body, and to which extent it should be moving around or limited to a specific place, the borders, the regulations, and based on that there is a perception of the human and humanity at the same time, and the dimension of al-lisan, different languages that even go as important and macro as going to political levels, legislating that some languages are the national languages, undermining other languages. There are so many linguistic conflicts in this world. In Spain, there is the Catalan, language, and there is the Spanish language. In North Africa, there is the Berber language and the Arabic language, and sometimes they are in harmony, and sometimes some languages. I mean, in the Turkish Republic, for example, at the beginning, I mean, for decades, it was unacceptable to talk Kurdish on the street, because there was this sensitivity toward the Kurdish and even the Arabic language. The letter was changed. If you remember that Ataturk changed the alphabet, so it's the linguistic dimension. Al-lisan is political as well. In which language do you speak, and what is the discourse? Not only the language, but the discourse you are using, that is sometimes excluding other variations of discourses when there is a secularization of the public sphere and the public debate, for example. These are imaginaries of the human. And if you look at yourself in the mirror, there are so many elements of civilization that are related to the human body. As I mentioned, to which extent reason is dominant or in harmony with other sources of knowledge, the emotional and compassionate dimension, and how it's placed in a society with its moral implications as well. The body, and the body includes not only the shape of the body or human beings and their bodies, there is also the body politic. So we have also gender issues. This is related to sex and body, which sex you are. And they use now the notion of gender, because they say sex is biological, gender is cultural, and all these debates regarding feminism, so it's based on a perception of the body and the importance of the body, but to which extent is it over taking the whole imaginary of the human existence. You have also the ability to produce. So your own body, whether the body is abused by a system, an economic system, and the body in terms of revolutions and the ability to contentious politics, many things, Tahrir Square and the Arab Spring, was about the presence with your body in the public sphere, which changed actually due to that multitude of people that came out on the streets, the political system. So the bodily is very present in the Islamic perspective, and how to tame the body, but respect it at the same time. Give it an importance and cherishes the individual body and the individual existence and the bodily dimensions by making so many opportunities for the body to express itself, to respect its even desires upon which the existence of the human being is based, but how to put it in a moral and ethical context that basically does not turn the moral system into an invented morality that focuses on desires and sexuality, for example, only, which is the case in some civilizations, that the fulfillment of the desires and the needs of the body comes first and then anything else, etc., according to historical comparisons between different civilizations. And then we move to the dimension of al-makan, the space. How civilizations dealt with spaces. It's very well known that even in different ideologies, the study of history is based on the economic factor, and the economic factor is based on nature. So we have in the Marxism the imaginary that some societies, if they are related to a river or to agricultural economy, they create a specific type of civilization based on that has its own political norms, mostly settled, so they do not revolt a lot because they are very much related to the production, and the production takes time, and you cannot just leave, compared to Bedouin societies, for example, where fighting against injustices is much more easier. People are nomads, and if they face a tyranny or an abusive authority, they can simply change the social contract, or they can simply leave altogether. The man puts his wife and the children on the camel and decides, no, I will not take humiliation, and I will simply leave, and it's easier. While if you are from an agriculture society, you are rooted, you cannot go anywhere. So it develops ways. Hussein al-Attas is one of the scholars from originally Malaysia, but settled in Singapore. He has very important writings how how the societies in colonial eras were accused of being lazy, while actually it was based on a sense of belonging to the culture and the land that was struggling to find its way to resist without using this excessive use of force, for example. Or in sociology, we have these writings regarding the subtle way of resistance in everyday life, for example, while in some other mountain societies like Afghanistan, we have, even in political science, nature makes a difference, so everyone was warned in the States, don't go into Afghanistan, you will not win a war in Afghanistan. Nature is against you, and nature is related to the nature of man as well. I mean, the traits of people, they can live to the minimum. They are not in the state of being modernized and urbanized to the extent that they have to pay a price for this urbanization by all the time negotiating. They can fight back. They can live on the minimum. They have the nature and the mountains. So it's a difficult war that you are going into. But they did not listen, and the struggle continued. While if you have a flat land with the people settling around the river, the political conditions and the political checks and balances calculations are different, etc. So al-makan, the space, and our understanding of nature and our understanding of building and architecture. Heidegger, as the German philosopher, has a very interesting text that is called Dwelling, Building, and Thinking, that talks about how actually the intellectual aspect of any society and civilization is very much related. It manifests itself in building, the way they build their architecture, but also architecture itself affects very much the way we think. So our thinking affects the way we deal with the nature around and build our buildings and cities and urban manifestations and urban fabric. But also this very urban fabric affects the way we deal with our society, because if you go into a building where there are very small windows, or if the streets are very broad, broad ways, you have these highways, it's different from a city that has small alleys where people can interact and know each other. While these big streets in the city, in the modern city, their aim is basically to facilitate mobility of capital and of workers. Okay, so the interaction between the workers is not what they care about, it's the production mainly. And then you have all these transportations and bridges, etc., that basically facilitate the modern life and the modern economy, but undermine the social interaction between people. And then we move to the following factor, which is after makan, as zaman. Zaman is time. Every civilization has got its own understanding of time, starting from the creation of the world. Is it a big bang? Or is it the moment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said kun fayakun, and then the human being was created, and then his destiny decided, and then came to this world, etc. So, or is it only here and now? There is this very famous bestseller book titled The Power of Now. So here and now is the definition of secularism, basically, that you think in terms of here and now, not in terms of that there is al-azal, the history before your creation, where according to the Islamic narrative, you gave an oath to Allah of Tawheed, Shahada, even before you were born. وإذ أخذ ربك من بني آدم من ظهورهم ذريتهم وأشهدهم على أنفسهم ألست بربكم قالوا بلى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took from the back of Adam his descendants, and he made them stand in front of him, and they made the shahada that he is the one and only. So you come, and Al-Quran and the nubuwat, the prophethoods and the messages are reminders, dhakr, they are reminders of the early oath that we gave before coming to this earth, that we will be witnesses of Allah's unity. And we are fulfilling this in this world. We are fulfilling this ahd, this mithaq in this world, and we will be judged accordingly in the hereafter. So you have our sense of time in Islam is a sense of time that goes from the azal to the abad and deals with the present, with al-an. But the present is related to a history, not only the history of the previous nations, and qasasul Quran, the stories in the Quran tell us about the human cycles and rise and fall of civilizations and nations, etc. But it tells us also about al-mala'ul a'la. It tells us about our creation and how Allah informed the al-malaika, the angels, that he is going to create the human beings, and this discussion about the human beings, and allama Adam al-asma, he taught Adam. All these things did not take place here and now. They affect us very much, and what we do in this here and now affects the day of judgment. This makes a lot of impact on how civilization actually deals with the here and now, because any legal system, any political system cannot grant justice fully. It's impossible. If there is no moral pillar in the society that basically makes people, because they believe in the day of judgment, become even more moral, even if the law is not watching them, even if there is no surveillance on the street. And this is the difference between societies when as we say always, the example when what happens if electricity is turned off, if a city is dark, in some societies when this massively happened, people went out and started looting. So the state is the one that is keeping you moral and ethical. If the state disappears, it will be like Hobbes said, the war of all against all. But in our Islamic perspective, no, there is a very important notion in Islam actually, and in Islamic civilization, that is extremely central to the human integrity and to the human ethical perspective in society, which is the notion of dhimma. And unfortunately, understanding the history of Islamic civilization, the notion of dhimma was placed basically in the aspect of ahlul dhimma. that you have the people of the book, and we call them Ahlul Dhimma in fiqh, and Ahkam Ahlul Dhimma, you know. But actually, the notion of Dhimma is much wider than minorities and dealing with minorities in Islam. A Dhimma is actually your responsible agency. So you have, we are in Dhimmatullah. Okay, so Prophet Muhammad, when he sent one of his companions to Yemen, and he said, "Dhimmatullahi wa rasuluh." You know, when people made the Islamic futuh, you know, conquests, if they called it so in English, you know, so there was always a dhimmatu wal ahd. There is that moral aspect that goes beyond the existence of the state. And the example I give to Christians in Egypt, we have a Christian minority who don't like the notion of the dhimma. You know, they say we are not ahl dhimma, we are citizens. Okay, we are equal citizens. So I used to teach to my students saying dhimma is actually a legal but also a moral social value and commitment. So in the Arab Spring, when we had the uprising in Cairo, for about 18 days, the police was completely absent. At the beginning, many police stations were burnt because of the great human rights violations that used to take place in police stations and torture, etc. So angry people in dense areas basically started burning the police stations when the uprising started. And the police disappeared, and the army came with the tanks to the streets, claiming that it's protecting the revolution, basically. And then we had negotiations, and the story went on for 2.5 years, till eventually we had a coup in the case of Egypt after 2.5 years. But at the beginning of the uprising, the police disappeared. And I remember on the day of on the night of the 28th, the end of the day of the 28th, when people stormed Tahrir Square and occupied it, that people realized that the police is not there. And the tanks of the army situated in central points in the city actually had no responsibility of keeping street security, because they will not leave the tanks, they will not leave their machinery and go and stop looting. This is not the responsibility of the army, this is the responsibility of the police. And I remember very well that on that night, I was staying over at a friend's house because I could not go back to Tahrir. I live on Tahrir Square, by the way. This is an interesting aspect of my life. So I stayed over with a friend, and looting started in this neighborhood. And people went down and found tanks in the main streets, and they addressed them and say, "Stop the looting." And the officers and the soldiers on the military tanks, they said, "This is not our responsibility. We are a military, we are not police." But the police disappeared, and they said, "None of our business." And people started forming popular committee to protect their own homes and houses. It was a moment when the state on the street level disappeared, basically, in terms of keeping the security. At that very moment, some people in some very popular areas and very dense areas in Cairo realized that the police is not there. What would happen to the churches? And there is a very great example that in one of the neighborhoods called Umraniya, there was this very big church, and it was next to a big mosque called Khatamul Mursalin. So people in the neighborhood used to call it Kaniset Khatam al-Mursalin, the Church of Khatam al-Mursalin, which is a very funny name because it's the Church of Prophet Muhammad. Yani it's Khatam al-Mursalin is Prophet Muhammad. But in, you know, locals, they say, oh, there is the Mosque of Khatam al-Mursalin and the Church of Khatam al-Mursalin next to the mosque, you know. So eventually it was called the Church of Khatam al-Mursalin. So the Salafis in the area felt that they are the more responsible ones for keeping the security of the church, because, I mean, if anything happens to the church, they are somehow liable for this. So they went and formed a popular committee for security in front of the church of that area. This is a notion of zimma. The notion that the zimma and the political and moral responsibility is actually embedded in the human agency of a Muslim. And of course, the state facilitates this. The state, basically, the apparatus of the state is a tool. Politics is not the ultimate goal. Politics is a tool. And beyond and after the state, and before and after the state, we are responsible for social contracts, and we are responsible for the moral, ethical aspects of our society. We are the guards of these aspects in society. So, al-zaman wal-makan are very important in the perception of what a civilization offers macro, but civility is the thread. It's not the etiquette. It's not being nice and kind. It's about the moral responsibility in its more complex manifestation. And this is actually called in Islam umran. So al-imara is the manifestation in the material sense, the architecture, the buildings, the city life, etc. But al-umran is more than that. It includes the moral dimension of living together, but it also includes the dimension of beauty, al-gamal. And beauty is not additional to our life, our social life, and our civilizational endeavors in the Islamic perspective. Beauty is an important component. It's embedded in that, whether you are a poor person or a rich person, a very wealthy society, or a society struggling with difficulties and circumstances that are dire in some economic crisis, etc. Beauty is part and parcel of our nature around us, and it should also be part and parcel of the civil virtues embedded in everyday life in the Muslim society. And this is an aspect that sometimes is overtaken, not regarded and not concentrated upon and minded by some understanding of civilization. At the end, there is also the dimension, again, of the mizan that comes with our understanding of the relations between different civilizations. There is a rising discourse globally of peace, peace and human cooperation and understanding. But war is one important aspect that we have to admit is part of the human history and human interactions, and the political international level witnesses a lot of wars, and even sometimes even civil wars. And a civilization that does not have a very strict moral and ethical standard for what happens when we go into war and what type of ethics and moralities we should be abided by and respecting and committed to when it comes to armed conflicts, and when it comes to using force in a society and with other societies, it's very important. And this is why fiqhul jihad is part and parcel of the Islamic civilization, because war exists, war happens. And if you don't have a fiqh, if you don't have a theory about a just war, and what are the limitations that you should stick to, and the boundaries when you are conducting war, then this civilization will go into conflicts and will exercise zulm and baghi vis-a-vis other communities and civilizations. And the example that we always give is that Christian civilization did not have a theory of war, of a just war, and hence when the crusades happened, they started looking for some sort of the church was supporting the monarchs, and then it stopped after a couple of centuries and said, what is going on here? We are supposed to be preaching love, we don't have a theory of war, we have to establish it. And St. Thomas Aquinas basically was the first to introduce a notion of a just war in Christian history. He said, let's face it, we are now conducting war, and we have at least to have a moral and ethical sort of frame for the war that we are conducting. And when he wrote about a just war and its meaning, it was copy and paste from the fiqh al-jihad in Islam. So the dimension of ta'aruf, but also tadafa, the way that the لولا دفع الله الناس بعضهم ببعض, there is that use of force that has its own moral framing, and that has its own cause and its commitment to justice. It's part and parcel of imagining a civilization and how it sets its boundaries and deals with the others on the international level as well. Everything that I mentioned is basically the baggage of what we define as civilization. Civilization is a word that is basically an umbrella for so many concepts and imaginaries that are different from one civilization to the other. And if you want to compare civilizations, you take these elements that I mentioned, the irfan, the mizan, the akwan, the insan, with its all different aspects of human existence, and then al-makan, strategic aspects, geographies, architects, building cities, urban factors, etc. And then az-zaman, understanding of history and time, and then al-umran, how people act in society and with other societies, and all of that is actually what we call civilization. The Islamic civilization, if you want to go through these different elements, introduce its different model across history. and then was subject to the domination of a different civilization with its different understanding of these factors, which is modernity, that came along with a colonial project that used force without an ethical frame, and claimed to be civilizing other nations, while it actually completely exploited these other nations. And in social sciences, we talk about decolonializing even social sciences, not only places and spaces, and the resistance continues, as we say. So this is how we see civilization, and each and every topic that I mentioned actually deserves a separate lecture. So I will stop here, and we can open the floor for discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Ustaz, for your valuable speeches. Honorable President, as you know that Professor Heba Raouf is one of the most famous and renowned political scientists, as well as Islamic scholar in the present world. This is actually our great chance to hear and ask questions to her. So we will not waste our time. We will directly go to the question answer session now. So I will request Sister Qazi Salma bint Salim to ask her first question.
Okay, I'm from sociology discipline. In all our courses, we are taught Western and European civilization. It is hard to find Islamic civilization in our courses, and it discourages us to take this discipline. And we all can realize the importance of this. So what will be your suggestion for us? What can we do? I think that you can make a reading list and start with the history of art. In Islam, there are some books on that, because it's like a big realm. No matter which window you use to look at it, it will lead you to the other factors. So I suggest that you start by, of course, history in terms of, historiography is very important. What happened to the history of civilizations? Different civilizations developed. What are the criteria and the changes that occurred on the historical level? But also the dimension of beauty, as I mentioned, is very important, and it tells you a lot about society. It tells you a lot about the concept of human beings and their nature, and it tells you about the production of knowledge and the production of ilm that is related to it. And there was an encyclopedia or a big book about Islamic arts that was published and written by Farouqi. So I think that starting with it will lead you to the different notions that we talked about. And also we usually start with, if you want to take the core of Islam, not the manifestations, you start with the Seerah, basically, because it tells you something, as I mentioned, about human nature, human society, ethics, the ultimate expression of ethical human existence, which is Prophet Muhammad. And then you see how he dealt with space and place and bodies and legislation and community and diversity and plurality in the society that he was living in, like in the Constitution of Medina, in managing the public and the private sphere, in dealing with women's issues. So you see the seeds of this civilization and then the manifestations. As mentioned in my introduction, part of the aspects of the Islamic civilization is the position of women, for example, that was witnessing ups and downs. Unfortunately, in some of our cultures today, there are so many jahiliyyah practices that are covered within Islamic discourse that are actually non-Islamic. So to understand the notions of culture and how they are very profound and shaping the civilization. Don't shy away from taking courses on civilization if they teach Western civilization, because you can always introduce the Islamic civilization in comparisons and in research. And I think that it's like there are so many aspects and dimensions that I mentioned that you can look for. There is the work of Al-Attas, Naqib Al-Attas in Malaysia as well, is very important to read. It's closer to you, to the subcontinent in Malaysia as well. He has great writings, and of course also the notions of Tawheed and how they shape the human society and the human self are important. So the book of Ismail Raji Farouqi on Tawheed is also important, published in English. There are so many aspects. I mean, if you want to look after a book that is titled Civilization, this is not the best way, by the way. you should look into the different aspects of civilization that I explained and see how Islam is basically shaping them and how it made that great civilization by restructuring and rebuilding the notions that I mentioned in a society that was basically pagan, anti-Tawhidi, and how which is mentioned by all historians of civilization, whether they like it or not, they all mention the fact that it is an amazing issue that they cannot explain till today. Even the Christians in Egypt, when they say, you know, Islam invaded us and Islam was forced upon us, sometimes our minorities have these interesting ideas under political pressure. They cannot understand, they cannot explain if Islam was spread by sword, how did it spread to all these nations? Everyone was like lame, they could not resist. I mean, what happened? How did Islam expand? And the same you can find in the works of Fernand Braudel, who is a very important historian of civilization, who said there is no explanation. How did Islam spread that fast? It's one of the fastest growing civilizations in terms of its history, that there is no explanation in history that, of such a short time where it just reached the different corners of the world. So you can start from anywhere. You can start from art, you can start from Tawheed, you can start from human understanding of the human nature, you can start from Islamic Sharia and how it sees the order of society, you can start from relations between Muslims and non-Muslims, you can start from anywhere. It will lead you to the rest of the system of understanding of Islam that actually manifests itself actually in different manners, by the way, because culture matters. And this is one of the most important dimensions in the Islamic civilization, that it respects diversity and the practices of people.
Thank you, and now we will go for our second question. Brother Riaz Ahmed.
Okay, we have a professor who loves talking about inter-civilization dialogue along with its beneficiaries, also comes up with so many references to great Islamic scholars. In addition to this, we came to know from the writings and the speeches of many scholars that inter-civilizational dialogue means nothing. This kind of dialogues are not allowed in Islamic perspective and so on. Would you please let us know anything about it? What is your perspective? Okay, Riaz Ahmed, thank you for the question. It's important to understand that there is not a single path. We have the dialogue as something that is part and parcel of our societies. We have to have this open dialogue, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran tells Prophet Muhammad, قُل, there is a qawl, there is something that is said, and there is فَإِن جَادَلُوكَ يَسْأَلُونَكَ, they ask you about this, they ask you about that. There is that dialogue going on in the Islamic society in the first place before even making a dialogue with the others. But the question is, there is no place for dialogue when you are basically attacked, when you are occupied, you have to resist. And resistance can take different types of strategies and tactiques as well. So it's neither nor, it's like it's neither full peace and we have to go to dialogue, etc. When we are occupied, and even under that condition, we have to have a dialogue amongst ourselves in the first place. So there is that relation between ta'aruf, which is the dialogue and debating and getting introduced to other cultures and other faith and other people, etc., people of faith, etc. And at the same time, tadafa, they complement each other. You cannot only have peace. Sometimes there is a dimension of war, and there have to be a use of force. So what do you mean by dialogue? In which context? So the colonials wanted to make a dialogue with the locals. No, we don't have dialogue. We will resist. During the invasion and during the war conducted against us. And then you can have negotiations later, political negotiations, to see how to manage issues when they are leaving the country. For example, peace negotiations in order to get independence historically or these circumstances. But it's not like an unconditional. The second thing is that sometimes we have these religious dialogues and we are debating the existence of God, etc. These are not dialogues for the public. These are dialogues for experts. They should be conducted in universities, in comparative religion departments. But when they go to the TV, for example, and people are making these sort of claims about different comparative religion aspects and topics, so sometimes the dialogues are important, but in which context? Otherwise, they can even raise civil war. So wisdom is actually our ultimate goal. What type of dialogue, in which context, on which level, conducted by whom, according to which principles. And we have in Islam actually a very important tradition of adabul jadali wal munadara, you know, the manners and the methods of dialogue and argumentation in Islam. We have them developed across Islamic history. So, and we have a lot of literature on that. So we argue and we learn how to conduct a dialogue with the other, whether it is the other politically or the other in terms of difference of faith. But in which context are we talking about dialogue? And who has the keys of the dialogue? Because many of our youth are invited to dialogues in the West, where they actually don't have a say in the organization of the platforms, in the setting of the agenda, and then they are invited to dialogues that divert them from many of the most important topics that we should be discussed globally. And also this is something that we need to look into. There has been a rising interest in the notion of dialogue in a moment of normalization with Israel in the Arab world, for example. We have to conduct dialogues of peace, etc. While they are still, till yesterday, occupying territories and kicking people out of their homes in Palestine. So what dialogue can I have with someone who is occupying me and kicking me out of my home? So it's a very fishy notion, and it's very important at the same time because we have the tradition of conducting and argumentation, conducting dialogues, etc. But it's the situating it in the right time and place and mode and agents of dialogue and participants. This is the question.
Thank you, Ustaz. And also thank you, brother, for asking the questions. And now we have our another sister, Nuren Nirvana Brishti. She gonna ask you directly, Ustaz. Yeah? Sister, please ask your question directly.
Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're well. My name is Nirvana Brishti. I think my question is marginally related with today's topic, but I tend to ask this question. I mean, I feel this question. So as we know, there were numbers of prophets who were sent by the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over the time. And it is also thought to be that prophets were sent in every corner of the world. So specifically, if I talk about my part of the world, I mean the subcontinent, Buddhism and Hinduism has been initiated from this part of the world. And some intellectuals tend to think that Sri Krishna and Gautam Buddha was actually a prophet, but people has misinterpreted their teachings and values. So ultimately they idealized them and made another religion like Hinduism and Buddhism. So to what extent this concept is valid? Thank you so much.
It's a difficult question. And I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer it, but I will tell you my opinion. I think that the distortion cannot reach the point of negating the existence of a God and the day of judgment altogether. And the distortion that we witnessed, for example, in Christianity is attributing divinity to Jesus. But we have the notions of the Bible, we have the notions of justice, we have the notions of the hereafter, we have the notions of the Genesis, the original creation of man. We have, I mean, something is distorted, but something remains. But if you find a religion that does not have a notion of God, I mean, I studied Buddhism in a course in the university, and it does not have a notion of God and not a notion of a day of judgment. What type of distortion is that? There is no substance. But if people admire, and this is one of the outcomes, for example, of dialogues, by the way, the opinion that you mentioned, you know, it's like because you try to convince yourself that it's important to sit and talk about these issues, the religious issues, you know, with different other faiths, etc., not how to coexist, which is more important, in my opinion. We will not change each other's faiths. I mean, if someone is interested, we can do da'wah, etc., but we don't go into the religious core, because if someone is a believer, he will not change his ideas. I mean, in the public debates, if someone seeks knowledge, they can come to the Islamic centers, or we can go and explain in a nice manner, like da'wah and tabligis, etc. So I'm not sure about that idea, but why are we trying to do so? I mean, why do some people insist that these were prophets, but it was distorted, etc., to create a bridge with the others and a sense of, you know, relation to them, etc. Because we assume that wisdom is only ours. Actually, truth and wisdom We believe in our faith, but wisdom can be searched in any tradition. I mean, if you find in the sayings and statements of Buddha something that is important and wise, it's okay. I mean, he was a human being who made something wise. We can use this wisdom. There is no problem. Why turn him into a prophet in order to feel that the wisdom means anything to us? It means a lot. Wisdom, human wisdom, is important as well. الحكمة ضالة المؤمن. حكمة. So I disagree with many of the things that are said by Hallaj, for example, or by even Maulana Rumi, for example, and some of his aspects of his thought. But it does not mean that I disregard the hikmah, the wisdom that is there, and look at it and benefit from it if it's beneficial, and leave aside what I can't benefit from of this hikmah, or what I find sensitive to deal with. Al-Hallaj, when he's talking about Ibn al-Farid, has beautiful poetry about Allah and his relation to Allah, etc. But when it starts getting into wahdatul wujud, I mean, this is something that I'm very sensitive towards. But using the hikmah and reading and understanding is actually something that we can do. So why are we need to bestow a notion of prophethood and then distortion of the risala on a faith that does not have the main two pillars, Tawheed and the Day of Judgment? So I'm a bit, I smile when I hear something like that, with all due respect to other communities that we are living with.
So the term is quite political indeed.
Yes, and the same, by the way, is now going on in Egypt. I will give you an example from the Middle East. In Egypt today, because of the fall of the Muslim Brothers, there is quite a propaganda against observant Muslims generally, and part of that change in the cultural mood that is being managed by the state and the state propaganda is basically raising the old affiliations and identities to just push aside the religious presence in the public sphere. So they are, maybe you have seen, if you Google, 1 month ago, we had this moving of the mummies from the old Egyptian pharaohs' mummies from one museum to the other, and there was a big parade, and women were wearing, the clothes of old pharaonic style, etc. And then in that they were saying, and by the way, the Islamists used to say that our forefathers, Egyptian forefathers, were pagans, because they have all these gods and goddesses, etc. And of course, we belong to that culture, but we don't belong to the faith. We are proud of our previous history, but we are not proud of what they believed in if they were pagans. What is the big problem about that? What is the conflict? But those who are ultra-nationalists and want to take us back to the old history and be proud of the old history, they say, but actually Akhenaton, who was a great pharaoh in Egypt, a king, was Tawhidi, because he wanted to unite all gods in the old Egyptian civilization in just one God. Okay, but this one God can be pagan as well. I mean, it is not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is describing the sun, for example, as the one and only God. This is a unity, not Tawheed. So you find this as well in some cultures. So they want to turn, and some of them said what you said. They said Akhenaton must have been a prophet, and then people distorted his message, etc. We don't need to go into that. Why? We just read the history. We see the development of the imaginary of the divine and compare. It's interesting. Why should I bestow something on someone who did not ask for it? It's exactly like the same. It's not the same, but it's similar to the debate when someone, a big intellectual, for example, in my country dies, and he was bluntly, openly atheist. And then people say, Rahmatullahi alayh. And some people say, I mean, he decided for himself to be atheist. Why are you imposing on him that he wants to have Rahmatullah? He didn't care about Rahmatullah. So why are you taking the decision for him? So it's not like you have to curse him, but you can just be silent. خلاص, a person died. تمام. Why should I bestow Rahmah or deny Rahmah, by the way? I have no, why shouldn't I keep to myself? خلاص, yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer, madam.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you. So the next question will come from brother Fazle Ilahi.
Assalamu alaikum, Professor. I hope you would listen to me loud and clear. Honorable Professor, we come to know that in the mid-18th and 19th century, the rise of factories provokes industrial revolution, and this industrial revolution promoted the concept of enlightenment. So as an undergraduate student of sociology, We've been told that this enlightenment is the foundation of modern human civilization, while we found that this enlightenment is nothing but a European intellectual movement or modern Western political and cultural movement. So would you please explain us your perspective on enlightenment? What's your direct or what's the direct or indirect influence of enlightenment in this modern era, in postmodern era?
There are two elements that I can explain. The first thing, that the Enlightenment was an endeavor to give back dignity to the human mind vis-a-vis the church, that was basically against exploration, against innovation, against many things, against human dignity, making coalitions with the monarchs and the tyrannic rules, etc. So it was an attempt of liberation from that. And the beginning of the Enlightenment, by the way, most of the Enlightenment figures were believers. So part of the Enlightenment is also it came after the religious Reformation. You know, they wanted to get out of the control of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, basically. And if you read the history of Europe, you'll understand. But the fathers of the Enlightenment were basically believers. And the example is the Scottish Enlightenment, for example. I mean, the Scottish Enlightenment was basically embedded in churches. And it came to introduce a notion of civic virtues and civil society that was very much linked to the religious society as well. The commitment to not to the self and salvation, but also the commitment to social virtues and the action in society and egalitarian demands, etc. So the Enlightenment came from that. But in the course of time, turning from Enlightenment to modernity, it entailed colonialism, it entailed the centrality of man and being marginalizing religion and then denying its importance altogether, etc. And even anticipating its fading away. You know, this was two things would fade away. In Marxism, they said, and Marxism is also part of the project of the Enlightenment. It split into two ideologies. So Marxism said the state would fade away, and the liberals said the religion will fade away. So we had these different types of anticipations and foreseeing the future. But the Enlightenment then was taken by the project of colonialism and also by modernity and post-modernity. So, and now in the post-human age, when we are talking about coming out of the project of anthropocentrism, that there is a centrality of man in this world, this now is being switched into a notion of that the human being does not really matter, machines matter, artificial intelligence matters, animals matters, ecology and environment matters, and the human being does not have that centrality that was claimed in Enlightenment and modernity. So we are entering a different era. And in this era, Muslims are supposed to admit that as well. I mean, every time we are in the position of defending ourselves and saying, of course we agree, yes, we do. You know, in Islam, we also have this importance of the environment, yes, but we are not environmentalists. We have the importance of the human being, but we are not humanists. You know, in terms of humanism, the ISM refers to the ideology. It's a different ideology, but we share some of the notions, but we have our own wider perspective that I explained in the lecture that has its own position towards every question and a different answer. So knowledge is a key factor. You have to understand where you're coming from and what is your project. Our project basically in this world is liberation and standing against the hegemony of Western globalization and creating our own futures.
Thank you so very much, Professor.
It's a pleasure. By the way, you have very nice names. يعني, there is no فضل إلهي, which is فضل الله يعني, or فضل إلهي, فضل الإله. Such names we don't have in the Arab world, by the way. I'm amazed sometimes by your names and how you pick from the Quran, sometimes even names that we don't usually use in the Arab world. So it's very fascinating. Subhanallah, culture is so amazing and the diversity in the Muslim world.
Blessed, alhamdulillah.
Thank you, Stada, for your answering, and also thanks, Brother Fazlilahi, for asking the question. Now we'll go for another question. It will be asked by Brother Saim Muhaiman.
Assalamu alaikum.
I
hope you are here. Thank you. Ustad, you know, in the last few years, many great events have taken place in the world, especially since the beginning of the last century. The whole world is divided into nation states. The political structure, the world map has changed radically. Significantly, the state of Israel has been established, and the map and politics of Middle East and Muslim countries are constantly changing according to the great Israeli project. In such a situation, what would be the alternative proposal of the existing oppressive political socio-economic structure? How we will build a new political structure, and what should we youth have to build a new livable world? Thank you, Ustad.
Thank you, Saim. I mean, it's a long issue. I mean, the nation state and its history and its power and its sovereignty, and challenging the sovereignty of the state and the propaganda machine that is accompanied. I mean, that it accompanies in its attack on civil society and people's demands for freedom and justice and equality is a big issue. So my opinion is that things do not emerge, you know, and push aside. There is, I mean, things don't happen by collapsing, but by emerging and pushing aside. You know, that you change the lifestyle, you change the ideas and minds, you change the practices, and you change the coalitions, and you change the tactiques and repertoires that you are using on the ground. The history of the tools you use on the ground have to change in order for you to challenge the nation state and basically transform it into a different political structure. The dimensions that I mentioned are also related to the notion of the state, whether the state is a representation of the will of the people or actually an oppressor of the people, which we witness in many countries in the third world, and even sometimes, but it's just behind the veil in the Western countries. I mean, there is the common will is basically hijacked by either the armies or the example that we usually give is the war against Iraq, when in 80 cities across the world, in April 2003, when Baghdad was attacked, many anti-war movements basically came to the streets, and there was 1 million people in London coming to the streets and protesting against the war on Iraq. But still, Tony Blair went ahead and made the coalition and the alliance with the Americans, and the British Army was there as well. So, so the voice of the people on the ground, on the street, did not matter much. So sometimes democracies show the ugly face, and sometimes democracies today in Europe are used for populism. My lecture actually after a few minutes is about populism and the spread of populism across the globe, in Burma, in India, in Latin America, in Europe, in North Africa, in Africa generally. I mean, everywhere you find populist leaders who want to sort of initiate ultra-nationalism and stand against the rights of minorities and the rights of immigrants, etc. So you have to invest in a public sphere on the levels that I mentioned, on the intellectual level, on the level of innovation, on the level of beauty, on the level of negotiation amongst different political and social groups, on the level of introducing a different vision of education. So you change the system, you cannot bring it down, it will fall over our heads, because it's a system that has such a power and such force that it would basically be willing to sacrifice nations in order for it to stay in power, these regimes. And the example is Syria. I mean, Bashar al-Assad does not care that 8 million to 10 million people of the Syrians are out of the country, almost 40%, yeah, or so, are out of the country now. He doesn't care, he's just staying there. And there is an herbicide, you know, a genocide, and an herbicide, herbicide means the genocide of places, not people. So some cities have been bombed to be yani, on the ground, yani, etc. But he doesn't care. The regime wants to persist, and people. I mean, half of the nation is now the nation is in pieces, yani. But they insist on staying in the seat of power, and supported by allies, global allies, and regional allies. So it has to be done with wisdom, and it has to start from a revolution of ideas. Sometimes we cannot change the circumstances, but we can think. And the ideas are a very important vehicle, maybe and when there is a political opportunity opened, and this is actually what happened in the Arab Spring. The Muslim Brothers, for example, stopped producing new ideas, and this was something I always used to criticize. I criticized the Muslim Brothers a lot when they were even on the rise. You know, in 2004 and 2008, I wrote criticizing their strategies and their political performance. And they were saying, what are you talking about? We are winning seats in the parliament. And, you know, but I could see that there is something wrong, that there is no production of ideas. And it's not enough to win votes on the ground if there is no project, if there is no reformation of the ideas that you started with 70 years ago. It's not enough. You have to have an intelligentsia and a political project that is reformed all the time. And they neglected that because they were taken by the victories, etc. And then eventually, when they reached the seats of power, when the Arab Spring happened, the uprisings took place, they didn't have a clear project of political management and tadbir, yani governance, etc. And they failed to understand the different the balances of the regime, and they thought that they can win through only having these massive support on the street. But the state is different in its structure, and it's not run by demonstrations. Demonstrations help change regimes even, but they don't help you run the system. So you have to have a project and ideas. So I think that in times when we are a bit witnessing a bit of despair, you know, yes, a bit, you know, people feel like there is no hope, regimes are killing ulama everywhere in the world, you know, and we are not being able to move outside our confined set spaces, and laws are banning so many activities, and what can we do? You can't, you should not stop thinking, produce ideas and think for the future. And even if we are incapable, yani the last conference I organized in Istanbul in my university, I was the coordinator with other colleagues, of course, was about post-humanism and technology and artificial intelligence. I'm a political scientist, but I try to push the agenda of understanding civilization to take it out of the historical in order to look to the future. And I suggested the topic of the conference to my colleagues and my director of the institute where I work, and we did that conference. It was last weekend, on artificial intelligence, technology, and the future of the human race. And you'll find that it's online. The whole conference is online now. So at least let's start by thinking, and also by the individual integrity. You know, everyone is responsible for his or herself. So if there are no ways for us to move, if there are so many restrictions, we can still use social media, use the technology that we have, prepare ourselves for a moment when actually there is a window of opportunity to be more active socially and politically, and produce ideas. We stopped producing ideas and we are just focusing on the history. And this is why I try to take the study of civilization out of this historical discourse, to see the paradigms, the different paradigms, and compare them, and then look to the future and the challenges. And it's important for Muslims to talk in the name of humanity, not only in the name of Muslims, you know, because we are rahmatun lil alameen. You always have to think in terms of the world. You have to be ahead, steps ahead, in envisioning how different oppressed nations and groups can gain equality and can gain freedom and dignity. And we should be the spearhead for such global change, even if we have our hands tied, but we don't have our hearts nor our minds tied. So even if the hands are tied a bit.
Thank you very much, Ustadha, for your answer.
Let me finish. Let me finish by saying that I was very honored to be with you today, and that actually I get very much inspired by youth. And when I got the invitation from Burhanuddin, I was very humbled by it. And I thank you for joining and for the patience. And I hope we stay in touch, inshallah. And I see thanks coming in on the chat. I'm the one who is very grateful for your time and for joining us. And I hope to stay in touch with you, inshallah. And all the best and good luck, and keep the hope. And inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make the last days of Ramadan blessed days, and enjoy the blessed Eid, inshallah.
Inshallah. Thank you, Ustadha. Actually, we had a lot of questions, but unfortunately, due to the time duration, we are unable to take all. I hope that this speech will open a new horizon for the new generation, and will open a door to rethink about the Islamic civilization. I think this program would be a documentation to understand the basics of Islamic civilization. We know that as a Muslim, this is our duty to build the world as a constructor, not as a destructor. So we will be accountable to Allah for our surroundings also. So the basics you gave us in today's program, especially, would be very helpful for us to build our society, inshallah, in a near future. Again, thank you very much, Ustada. We'd expect you again, inshallah, in our next program. Maybe one day we'll be able to host you in Bangladesh also. We expect that.
It would be my pleasure.
Inshallah. Thank you very much again. Salam everyone. Salam alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam. Jazakumullah khair.
Bye.